You're a battle-hardened Crusader knight, fresh off months of siege warfare, your armor finally stowed away, and you've got a heavy purse of plunder burning a hole in your belt. The year is 1187, and you've just stumbled into a dimly lit tavern in Jerusalem where the air reeks of stale wine, unwashed bodies, and something far more dangerous: violence. You think you know what a rough night out looks like? You think your weekend bar crawls are intense? You're about to discover just how catastrophically tame your modern nightlife really is compared to the absolute mayhem that was Crusader entertainment. The medieval tavern scene wasn't just rowdy. It was a powder keg of armed warriors, desperate gamblers, and moral chaos that would make modern nightclub bouncers quit on the spot. These weren't casual drinking establishments where knights politely sipped ale and discussed theology. They were violent, lawless dens where holy warriors routinely abandoned every principle they'd sworn to uphold, and where a single dice game could end in public assassination. Let me paint you the real picture of what Crusader nightlife actually looked like. Because everything you think you know about medieval entertainment is sanitized Hollywood nonsense, the reality was so brutal, so utterly chaotic that church authorities explicitly forbade military order members from entering these establishments. And for good reason. These places didn't just serve alcohol, they served as recruitment centers for every vice imaginable, and they turned God's holy warriors into something far more terrifying than any enemy they'd face on the battlefield. The crusading movement was supposed to be the ultimate expression of Christian devotion, armed pilgrimage, sacred warfare, spiritual purification through combat. But here's what the chroniclers didn't want you to know. The moment these holy warriors set foot in taverns, every noble ideal went straight out the window. Fighting on crusade might have been holy work, but keeping crusaders out of bars proved absolutely impossible. And bars brought consequences that would shock you to your core. Medieval taverns operated on a completely different level of danger than anything you can imagine today. These weren't just places to grab a drink after work, they were complex ecosystems of violence where different establishments served distinct purposes, each more dangerous than the last. At the bottom tier, you had ale houses, dark, cramped spaces reeking of stale beer where common soldiers gathered to drink cheap cider and mead. These places were powder kegs waiting to explode, filled with armed men who'd been trained from childhood to settle disputes with steel. But the real chaos happened in the upscale taverns. These establishments specialized in wine made from fermented fruits, and they attracted a more dangerous clientele. Knights with money to burn, mercenary captains flush with plunder, displaced nobles looking for trouble. These places offered more than just alcohol. They provided gambling, entertainment, and access to services that would make your modern adult entertainment district look like a church picnic. Here's where things get absolutely insane. Medieval people didn't just drink for pleasure, they drank because clean water was often unavailable and alcohol was literally safer than water in many locations. But this created a society where functional alcoholism was the norm and where armed warriors were routinely intoxicated while carrying weapons they'd been training to use since they were 7 years old. The weapons situation was what turned ordinary bar fights into bloodbaths. Every crusader carried knives as standard equipment. Not decorative pieces, but functional combat weapons designed for killing. When modern people get into bar fights, they throw punches. When medieval crusaders got into bar fights, they drew steel. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming and terrifying. Coroners' records from the period are absolutely packed with alcohol-related accidents, mishaps, injuries, and murders. Take the massive brawl that erupted in Paris at Sainte-Geneviève in 1288. This wasn't some minor scuffle between a couple of drunk guys. This was a tavern-wide riot that started with a simple argument between a pimp and a disgruntled customer. By the time the dust settled, virtually the entire establishment had joined in. Not because they had personal stakes in the conflict, but because they thought large-scale violence looked like fun. This was recreational warfare, and it demonstrates just how normalized extreme violence had become in these environments. But that was just punches and kicks. When things got serious, when knives came out, the fatality rates skyrocketed. Medieval chroniclers describe these escalations with clinical precision that reveals just how routine they'd become. Proximity to weapons plus familiarity with how to use them created a deadly combination that turned minor disagreements into public executions. The Latin East, the heartland of the Crusader states, was exponentially worse than anything happening back in Western Europe. While authorities in places like England and France might attempt to regulate weapon carrying in civilian areas, nobody even tried to implement such policies in the Crusader territories. These were frontier societies where everyone was armed, everyone was dangerous, and everyone knew that survival depended on being more violent than the next guy. Medieval cities in the Crusader states were absolutely packed with mercenaries, professional soldiers, and armed peasants who carried swords, knives, and other weapons as naturally as you carry a cell phone. Large-scale militias existed for community defense, and the general population was trained in combat because they never knew when they might need to fight for their lives. This created an environment where tavern disputes could escalate from verbal arguments to mass casualties in seconds. But the violence was just the beginning. These establishments were also the epicenters of the most sophisticated gambling culture in human history. Medieval gambling wasn't casual card games or friendly wagers. It was an all-consuming obsession that crossed every cultural boundary imaginable. Monks gambled, nobles gambled, common soldiers gambled, men and women gambled. Christians and Muslims gambled together. This wasn't recreational entertainment. This was the primary source of excitement in lives that were otherwise brutally short and incredibly dangerous. The games themselves were designed for maximum addiction potential. Dice games required no skill, no intelligence, no talent, just pure chance, which meant anyone could play, anyone could win, and anyone could lose everything they owned in a single throw. The most famous medieval gambling game, Hazard, was allegedly invented by Crusaders during the siege of a Syrian castle. These weren't games of strategy like chess. These were pure gambling, pure risk, pure adrenaline rushes that kept warriors coming back night after night. Archaeological evidence from the Holy Land tells a shocking story about just how widespread this gambling culture really was. Gaming boards, dice, tokens, and gaming counters have been found throughout the region, but here's the truly surprising part. A disproportionate number of these finds come from religious houses and the castles of military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers. The warrior monks who'd taken vows of poverty and chastity were apparently spending their time rolling dice and betting on games of chance. The gambling wasn't just harmless entertainment, it became a serious military problem because it distracted Crusaders from their actual mission. Chronicles describe knights becoming so obsessed with gambling that they neglected their duties, spent their equipment money on dice games, and sometimes even gambled away their weapons and armor. Church authorities recognized gambling as a gateway vice that led to more serious moral failures, but they were powerless to stop it. And this brings us to one of the most shocking assassination stories in Crusader history. Hugh, the Lord of Jaffa, had just been found guilty of revolt against King Fulk of Anjou in 1134. He was sentenced to 3 years of exile, but instead of quietly accepting his punishment and leaving the Holy Land immediately, Hugh made a fatal decision. He decided to stick around Jerusalem for a few more weeks, indulging in the gambling and drinking opportunities the capital offered. Picture the scene. Hugh is sitting at a dice table right there in the street, probably half drunk, completely absorbed in his game. The table was set up in front of a merchant's shop in what was called the Street of the Furriers. This wasn't some back alley gambling den. This was public, brazen gambling happening in broad daylight on a main commercial street. Hugh was so focused on his dice that he had absolutely no awareness of his surroundings. No thought of danger whatsoever. Then, without warning, a Breton knight approached the table. In front of everyone watching, this knight drew his sword and repeatedly stabbed Hugh to death, right there over the gaming table. The assassination was so public, so brazen, that chroniclers specifically mention it happened before all the bystanders. This wasn't a private murder or a secretive political killing. This was a public execution carried out in broad daylight while the victim was gambling in the street. Think about what this tells us about Crusader society. A high-ranking noble, even one in political disgrace, felt completely safe gambling publicly in the streets. The gambling culture was so normalized that even exiled lords couldn't resist participating. But more importantly, the violence was so routine that assassinations could happen in broad daylight with crowds of witnesses. And apparently nobody was particularly surprised by it. The gambling obsession went far beyond simple entertainment. Medieval chroniclers describe it as a serious threat to military effectiveness because it distracted warriors from their actual purpose. Knights would become so absorbed in games of chance that they'd neglect their duties, spend their equipment funds on wages, and sometimes literally gamble away their weapons and armor. Church authorities recognized gambling as a gateway vice that inevitably led to more serious moral failures, but they were completely powerless to control it. The most popular games required no skill whatsoever, which made them incredibly addictive. Anyone could play, anyone could win big, and anyone could lose everything in a single throw of the dice. The psychological rush was intense enough to hook seasoned warriors who'd faced death in battle without flinching. These men had conquered cities and survived siege warfare, but they couldn't resist the thrill of rolling dice for money. But gambling was just one layer of the moral chaos that defined Crusader nightlife. These taverns also served as the epicenter of a thriving prostitution industry that operated with shocking openness. Even when you reached the supposedly holy Crusade estates, many of the local bars were functioning as brothels. The line between drinking establishment and whorehouse was practically non-existent. Contemporary accounts describe the situation with brutal honesty. Usama ibn Munkidh, a diplomatic observer and chronicler, recorded multiple entertaining stories about Frankish prostitutes he'd encountered, though he was diplomatically careful to claim these were stories a friend had told him. The reality was that prostitution was so widespread and normalized that even diplomatic visitors were writing about it in their memoirs. The integration of alcohol and prostitution created an explosive combination that regularly erupted into violence. Arguments over unpaid bills, inadequate services, or men failing to perform and blaming their companions were routine sources of conflict. When these disputes involved armed crusaders who'd been drinking heavily and were already trained killers, the results were predictably catastrophic. Constantinople, a major stopping point for crusaders traveling to the Holy Land, had established extensive brothel districts located in side streets near the Forum of Constantine. Foreign visitors expressed shock at the open nature of the vice trade, with prostitutes working the streets in broad daylight. The Crusaders would publicly condemn this moral degradation, then immediately become customers themselves. The hypocrisy was so blatant that it became a running theme in contemporary chronicles. The situation in the Crusader states themselves was even more chaotic. In 1268, Sultan Baybars refused to negotiate a truce with the Crusader lord of Jaffa, and his reasoning reveals just how notorious these establishments had become. According to the chronicler Ibn al-Furat, Baybars specifically complained that the Franks had set up a tavern in Jaffa and put a number of Muslim women into it as sex workers. The Sultan considered this such a serious violation of diplomatic norms that he refused to engage in peace negotiations. The reputation of Frankish taverns spread throughout the region and across religious communities. Records from the Jewish community in Egypt document complaints about local shellfish gatherers who were drinking white Egyptian beer in Frankish taverns of bad repute. These establishments had become so infamous that their reputation crossed cultural and religious boundaries, serving as symbols of moral corruption throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. So the next time you're complaining about rowdy bars or dangerous nightlife, remember the Crusader taverns of medieval Jerusalem. These weren't just places where holy warriors went to unwind. They were lawless kingdoms where armed killers gambled away their souls, where political assassinations happened over dice games, and where the line between sacred mission and moral chaos disappeared entirely. Your wildest night out would barely register as a quiet evening in these medieval dens of violence and vice.